get started. Welcome to another week of the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture Seminar Series. The rest of the speakers for the quarter are all up and listed on our website at bec.ucla.edu, and the website is actually being revamped, so look forward to a new and even more beautiful website coming your way soon. Next week we have Perry Clark coming from the UC Davis Department of Anthropology, and he's going to be talking about infanticide and reproductive restraint in baboons. And this week I am pleased to welcome Dominic Johnson, who's here for the year as a visiting scholar through Beck and the UCLA Department of Anthropology. His home institution is the University of Edinburgh, where he's a reader in politics and international relations. And he's going to be talking today about adaptive politics. So welcome, Dominic.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for hosting me here. It's really exciting to be back among evolutionarily minded people. My original background was in evolutionary biology, and then I jumped ship, and I'm now in politics and international relations. That was deliberate, not a mistake. I'm interested in what evolution might tell us about politics. But I'll start with a joke, if I may. A cruise ship sinks in the ocean, and a group of survivors are washed up on shore. There's a group of Germans, a group of French, a group of Greeks, Americans and British. And in each of these groups there's two guys and a girl. And after 3 months, one of the Americans has shot the other one and is very happily connected with the woman. The two Germans have a strict alternating schedule of a 1 week on, 1 week off. The French have formed a nice menage a trois. The two Greek men are sleeping with each other and ignoring the women. And the three Brits are still waiting to be introduced to each other. We are a little bit reserved. I've met many of you, but not all of you, so please feel free to accost me in the corridor and introduce yourself. I'm doing various things while I'm here, but I'm particularly interested in hearing your views on my main project, which is a book project called Adaptive Politics, the Strategic Advantages of Psychological Biases. And I'm really keen to get your feedback and ideas about this project while I'm here. So here's an outline of what I was going to talk about today. Briefly, a bit of context about something called the Natural Security Project, which this project is a part of. And then I want to talk a little bit about resistance to evolutionary explanations in political science, because this is a major barrier for all of the work I'm doing, and particularly this book. Then I'll describe to you the idea behind the book, and give you one example. It's going to focus on 5 different things, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on one, go into it in a little bit of detail, and then hopefully have plenty of time for discussion and your feedback. What's this Natural Security Project? It's a project initiated by Rafe Sagarin at the top left there, who's a marine biologist, was here at UCLA for a while, is now in Arizona, and Terry Taylor on the top right, who was a soldier in the British Army and is now the director of the International Council for the Life Sciences in Washington, D.C. And these two guys brought their different areas of expertise together to think through how evolution might have insights for security in international politics. It started out as a set of workshops in Santa Barbara at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. Dan Blumstein, sitting there from biology here at UCLA, is part of this group. And after a couple of years, we produced this book, which is basically laying out a whole bunch of ideas. We're now taking that on and trying to suggest ways we can test these ideas. But it comes down to a very simple idea, and I'll be honest, it was inspired by 9/11, and the idea that in the last century, international security was very much dominated by states, interactions between states, which were known entities, more or less. But this has very much changed in the new century with the rise in prominence of non-state actors, and the quintessential example is the transnational terror networks. But there are many other examples as well, including insurgencies, weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, ethnic violence, as well as natural disasters, which we argue have many of the same common elements, not confined to traditional kind of national level analysis. And although these obviously are very different, we argue that they have some important common properties. In particular, that they are unpredictable, that they are requiring very adaptive responses to deal with them. They're not monolithic nation states with known histories. They are very different sorts of threats and share this common problem of posing unpredictable threats. So our idea is very simple, just that we can look to Darwin for insights about how to build adaptive responses. And the problem of unpredictable, rapidly changing threats may be a novel phenomenon in human society, but it's been a constant feature of nature since the dawn of life 3.5 billion years ago. If you think about it, all organisms face threats to their security through competition, predation, resource scarcity, extreme heat, cold, etc. So perhaps there are lessons to be learned from nature. Obviously there are important differences between animals and humans, but we think what's interesting are the common patterns between them. And the question is, are there lessons for us? So this is sort of going beyond what many of us sort of think of as the important part of evolution for a human phenomena, the 2 million years or so of evolution of the human lineage, but actually the whole 3.5 billion years of innovation on Earth, and the 100 or so million species which are on Earth, only 1.5 million or so of which have even been named. And then beyond that, the billions of adaptations within and between species, all of which you can see as a sort of big natural experiment in different ways to deal with unpredictable and rapidly changing threats. And I'm going to fly through this because it's just the context for the talk, not the talk itself. But we think there's sort of 5 general themes of insight from a Darwinian approach for any human social phenomena, but especially for security. I'll just give you a quick example of each. Biomimicry. You can all think of examples of this. This is shark skin, which has turned out to be extremely useful in recreating coatings for swimsuits, but also for the coatings of ship hulls. It's very resistant to turbulence. There are many examples of biomimicry, copying ideas from nature. Also, ecology. Can we use the tools of ecology to understand how populations change and interact over time? That might be useful for international security if, for example, we can use ecological models to study insurgency, which is one of the projects we've been working on. What about adaptation? Well, the process of adaptation itself, variation, selection, replication, explains a lot about how things change, irrespective of what those entities are and the context. And one of the things the working group has been doing is trying to track mechanisms of adaptation to, for example, the IED threat in Iraq, and noting that it's very slow, it's not very effective, and there's a massive time lag. And we argue that the insights of Darwinian evolution can help to sort of frame these problems and understand how to improve adaptation. But the holy grail is adaptation by definition is too slow. You're reacting to something that's already happened. And there's been a lot of interest in the people we've been speaking to about adaptability, generating the ability to adapt. And one of the examples that Rafe is fond of showing is how after 9/11 the United States created the Department of Homeland Security, which is this organizational structure here, which then had its next major test after Hurricane Katrina, and everyone's question was, where was FEMA? And FEMA is right here, buried within this enormous bureaucracy, which many people felt was not a good way of generating adaptability in the face of novel threats. And then finally, very important, and the topic of today's talk is ethology, animal behaviour, evolutionary psychology, both humans and non-human animals. I won't say more about that because it's the theme for today's talk, other than that this is Dan's area, Dan Blumstein, who studies, among other things, marmots. This is the Nature paper that our working group published recently this year. And Dan's done a lot of very interesting work on signalling behaviour, and he gives a great talk called 14 Lessons of Anti-Predator Behaviour for Security. But the project is multidisciplinary. We're interested in all sorts of different disciplines which have multiple applications but are unified by this Darwinian approach. and we are doing a whole bunch of different projects, but open to ideas, suggestions, new people. So I hope some of you may be interested to talk to me more about that. But anyway, the ethology theme. Before getting on to this idea of adaptive politics, let me talk briefly about the resistance to evolutionary explanation in political science. Now, we could say we don't care about this, let's just get on with our work. But having already joined a political science department, I've sort of made it my mission to bring evolution in rather than trying to push it in from the outside. But it is a significant resistance. I walk past this every day, which is Edinburgh Castle, a very peaceful scene. But this structure was actually built about 800 years ago to keep English people like me out of Scotland. And I'm constantly struck by the history of intergroup conflict. This is from Braveheart, and certainly in our country we've had a good 2,000 years or more of fairly constant conflict between England and Scotland. And it's just a reminder of the history of intergroup conflict throughout human evolution. There's a lot of mounting evidence that is very significant. Sam Bowles estimates that around 15% of male deaths in human evolutionary history has been due to warfare. So we might expect very significant selection pressures on adaptations for intergroup conflict. But this is pretty much heretical in many political science circles. There's various sort of core objections for using biological explanations for any sorts of behaviour, and in particular biological explanations for war. Of course, you've got the blank slate paradigm, which you're all very aware of, that they don't like the idea that biology does anything to influence our culture, that we can be anything, we can learn anything. Now, at the other end of the extreme, you have the rational choice paradigm, which is quite dominant in political science, particularly in the United States, but which argues that, you know, we're big-brained organisms and we can pretty much calculate what we need to do, and we should expect fairly optimal behaviour without significant influences of biological biases, biological mechanisms. And then three other big things, the sociobiology debate. I can't tell you the number of times that people have said to me, I'm sorry, but the sociobiology debate is dead. It was solved 30 years ago and you were on the wrong side of it. They don't seem to be very aware or interested in the new evolutionary psychology, as you might call it, or I would say just the regular research coming out of biology, which is very important in demonstrating the important role of biology in human behaviour and physiology. Great concerns for genetic determinism. Political scientists on the whole tend to see biological traits as fixed, not very aware of gene-environment interactions or phenotypic plasticity and so on. This is going to have to change. There's been some landmark papers in a couple of big political science journals about the influence of genes on voting behaviour and political preferences. The fact that they were published at all is really promising, but of course has, you know, stirred up a huge wasp's nest of debate. And then there is also this problem of biology being seen as immoral, the idea of selfish genes, and it's just a constant battle to explain the naturalistic fallacy and to explain the goal as explaining behaviour and not justifying it. It's actually a bigger problem than that, because even if they accept those arguments, even if they buy evolutionary psychology, many of them will tell you that it doesn't matter, because the behaviour of states in the international system is not necessarily influenced very much at all by individual human beings. So you could sort of broadly divide political science research up into three themes at different levels of analysis. The study of individuals, the so-called great man theory of history. There's the study of states, organisations and institutions, and then the study of the system as a whole. What is it about the world and global politics which defines how states should operate within it? And the extreme version of that argument is that it doesn't matter if Hitler or Bill Clinton was in charge of Germany in the 1930s, Germany's behaviour would have been roughly similar. But that is the extreme form of that argument. But anyway, you can see the problem. If political scientists see the system and states as important, then there's actually a small role for individuals. APSA is the American Political Science Association, the biggest political science association in the world. And these are the organised sections. So if you go to one of their conferences, there's about 5,000 people, and they're going to different talks under these themes generally. There's no evolutionary psychology, there's no evolution. I think they're there's a lot of scope for it. I've highlighted a few where I think evolutionary psychology would have a lot to say. What's interesting is there used to be a section on evolutionary psychology, and it actually disappeared because of lack of interest. There is this separate organisation, the Association of Politics and the Life Sciences, but they're very separate. They have their own conference, and it also almost compounds the problem because they've divided themselves off from the mainstream and are not sort of engaging with the mainstream literature or the mainstream theories. So fairly sort of pessimistic picture, but it's a shame because I think there's a great promise for evolutionary psychology. Political science has a lot of important problems to solve. I would say they have a pretty poor model of human nature, mostly rooted in philosophy. Little predictive power, I think they'd admit that, and no experimental tradition. And for us, this is quite striking, I think, because the subject of analysis is ultimately humans, even if they're interested in institutions and global politics, and also a range of humans in different contexts. So I think there's a lot to do. There are some promising signs. These are two books in recent years. This is Bradley Thayer's book, Darwin in International Relations, published in 2004. And this is Steve Rosen's book. He's a military historian at Harvard, teaches on politics, and this is a very good book looking specifically at war and human nature from an evolutionary and neuroscientific perspective. But on the whole, it's an upward struggle. So I'm going to talk about the book project now, and I want to do the book project because I think it's interesting in itself, but part of the goal is actually to climb over this big barrier and this resistance to evolution and somehow develop a hook to get them interested. And this is the idea that I've come up with. So this is Richard Nixon. And one thing that was interesting about him is that towards the end of the Vietnam War, he tried to cultivate the idea that he was mad in the eyes of Ho Chi Minh. So the war had already been going on in Vietnam for a long time, and Nixon thought that maybe it would end if there was a serious belief in North Vietnam that the United States would be prepared to resort to drastic measures, in particular use of nuclear weapons. And Nixon thought this was most likely to work if he could cultivate this image of being irrational, unpredictable. It was called the Madman Theory, and there's some interesting papers have been written up about this episode. And of course it flies in the face of the rational choice paradigm, but it raises this question, could irrationality be superior? It didn't work, of course, in Vietnam, but there are other cases in history where you could argue that some elements of irrationality actually may have been useful. So you'll know the chicken game, you're driving towards each other in a truck, who's going to swerve at the last minute. I've done a couple of case studies of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's not a bad model of roughly what was going on. And I think there's good evidence to suggest that JFK actually succeeded in playing the craziest strategy. There's only 24 hours from the time the crisis was resolved until the United States had already committed to invading the island, and all that would have led on to. So perhaps some hints that irrationality might be advantageous. Now all of these are examples of conscious planning, and I'm interested in evolved subconscious psychological biases, but they at least raise the question, could it be that common psychological biases are sometimes advantageous or strategically adaptive, strategically advantageous in political settings? And by biases I'm talking here about things like overconfidence and cognitive dissonance. And the best tools to at least ask this question, I think, are certainly in evolutionary psychology. So just to expand a little bit on the difference of perceptions of biases, here's two sort of caricatures of the paradigms in each field. So judgment and decision making for political scientists, and I'm focusing here on the kind of rational choice people, is a balance of the costs and benefits and probabilities of the contemporary world. For evolutionary psychologists, it's the same thing, but geared towards the evolutionary past. So that sets up very different expectations of behaviour, which is optimal for the rational choice theorists, ideally, but not always optimal for evolutionary psychologists. What's the proximate cause of this behaviour? Well, for the political scientists, it's some sort of rational calculation. We wouldn't deny that. By the way, I keep saying we, meaning evolutionary psychologists, and you can reserve your judgment as to whether I belong in your esteemed crowd. But I would say we also agree rational calculation is very important, but there's also additional biological mechanisms which are very important in determining behaviour. What's the ultimate cause? Well, some form of economic utility is common in political science explanations. For us, it's Darwinian fitness. So what does all this mean for psychological biases? Well, I think political scientists, they often accept them. They buy the results of Kahneman and Tversky and all of the other experimental psychologists, but they see them as cognitive limitations or mistakes or errors. Whereas we, I think, would just call them context-specific problem-solving mechanisms. Perhaps not all of them, but many of them. What's the result? Political scientists would say they tend to cause disasters and policy failures and wars, whereas I think we'd say, well, they just cause behaviour, and the result depends on the context. In particular, very important, the source of variation, and I don't think they have a good explanation for that. They might tell you it's something to do with complexity. When the situation gets very complex, that's when the cognitive limitations start to impede political decision making. But we have nice theories about exactly what the proximate triggers are and when we should see these biases and when we shouldn't. So you're familiar with the consequences of this, examples of evolutionary mismatch, both in human and non-human examples. It's a reed warbler feeding a cuckoo chick. Very hard for an economist to explain. It looks maladaptive, but of course it's perfectly adaptive behaviour, but just wrongly triggered in this setting. And this happens a lot, but is rare for any one particular reed warbler. Also happens in humans. Evolutionary mismatch. This is a baby, and babies of course are very stupid, but I haven't got a good visual example of a human evolutionary mismatch. So I think the evolutionary psychological approach is very important because we need to understand evolved mechanisms. And what people often say to me is, well, that's all very well, but modern politics is nothing like the ancestral environment, so what can you really tell us? But that's exactly the point. Evolutionary psychology is promising because it tells us about the context and cues which actually predict instances of mismatch, failure, if you like, of biological mechanisms to bring the results that would be considered adaptive. But also, on the other hand, the cause and effects of these same biases are sometimes similar in the modern world, and therefore they can be seen as successful. And this is the crucial part of the idea, because it's basically a trick or a hook to try and convince political scientists. I think they buy the idea that psychological biases are there, they're sometimes important, and they sometimes cause disasters. I think a different perspective would be to focus on when they're adaptive, when they cause effective behaviour, and that would at least force them to think about the fact that if these biases have some sort of utility, why do they have a utility? Where does it come from? What were they originally designed to solve? And I don't think it's a sort of unprecedented idea. Certainly in nature, there's good examples of the opposite of mismatch, evolutionary matches. This is a peregrine falcon, which is beautifully adapted to modern urban city landscapes. They like nesting on ledges, and skyscrapers provide lots of nesting habitat. I don't really have a great example for humans other than, you know, some modern technologies, modern settings perhaps can be considered adaptive because they further your goals, whatever those goals might be. And, you know, here I'm thinking of status and prestige, but you've probably got some better examples. So there's a few caveats to all this, which I'll come to in a minute. But the point of the book is very simple. It's to demonstrate examples of psychological biases being at least potentially adaptive. And I'll take slightly longer on this slide just to explain the biases that I'm planning to study and what their significance is for political science. And then the meat of the book is going to be a case study which kind of carries this message to the political scientists. Very deliberately using the case study approach because it's a very widely used methodology in political science, and many of them are much more open to that kind of approach than they would be to, for example, quantitative data or models or something. Although later in the talk I will show you an experiment and a model on overconfidence as one example. So what are they? Well, the first one is overconfidence. It's very significant because of its implications for the causes of war, which is one of the big central questions in international relations theory. I'm still looking for case studies, and it's one thing I'm interested to get your feedback on. I'll come to this more later. The second one is cognitive dissonance, and I'll explain more about overconfidence in a minute because it's my example, but briefly, cognitive dissonance is basically the bias whereby you become very attached to what you've already decided to do, and you're unwilling to take on board new information which may contradict that choice. This is potentially very important for war termination, a very important area of research in political science. It doesn't have very good explanations. In terms of case studies, I've been thinking about things like insurgencies, where very weak sides, interestingly, often persist in what might be seen as a sort of hopeless goal. The fundamental attribution error is where your behaviour is likely to be perceived by me as indicative of your disposition. You're doing it for a reason. Whereas if I do exactly the same thing, then I'm likely to put that down to situational constraints. I'm doing it because I have to. Another sort of widely established bias, potentially very important for the so-called security dilemma. If Dan builds nuclear weapons, I don't know what his intentions are. All I know is he's got nuclear weapons, so the best option for me is also to build nuclear weapons. And this is the so-called security dilemma, which leads to arms races, even though we might prefer to cooperate. An example of this being potentially useful might be, for example, the kind of cases like the 1930s in Europe leading up to the Munich crisis, where Hitler's intentions were underestimated. So anyone with a sort of fundamental attribution error at the time, like Churchill, might have been more likely to see Hitler's intentions as they really were. You can see the difficulty of finding case studies here, but I'll talk more about that later. Prospect theory. This is the difference in how people respond to risk with positive and negative gains. So if I offer you $10 but I also offer you the chance of $60 if you roll a 6 with a normal die. Now, what's interesting is that they're equivalent in terms of expected utility, but when they're positive amounts that you will gain from this choice, people tend to be risk averse and they choose the certain $10 option. If you then reverse that and say I'm going to either take $10 from you, or I'm going to roll a dice and may take 60 if I roll a 6, then in fact people become much more risk prone and are more likely to take the gamble. It's already been quite well studied in political science, and people have used it for an explanation for why Japan decided to attack the United States in 1941. Widely seen as a kind of crazy decision, but given their strategic situation at the time, trying to expand their empire in the Pacific, but suffering from a critical decline in oil reserves, people argue they were in this so-called domain of losses, where they could either take the uncertain option of attacking the United States, or the definite loss of not having access to critical oil supplies. And of course they didn't expect to win, but they expected to improve their negotiating position. The colours here, by the way, are what I want is a green example, something where the bias actually aids the goals of that state or those leaders. I've put the top one in orange because, of course, their overconfidence might have been useful in the beginning, but was ultimately the cause of their downfall as well. And it just doesn't work in Japan's case because they ultimately failed. The final one is in-group, out-group bias. I think it's extremely significant for ethnic conflicts, another huge area of research in political science, of course. But many examples where, just taking an evolutionary perspective without any moral judgments about it, it's incredibly effective at motivating people to a cause. So that's the idea. Take 5 big, well-established biases already well known in the political science literature, and to make the argument that they are not cognitive errors, limitations or mistakes, but at least potentially in some cases useful. Some caveats which I'm sure all of you are starting to think about already. It could well be that any one of these biases actually do result in failure, maybe most of the time. I think that's quite possible. All I'm saying is that if 10% of the time they result in success, it suggests that there can be a utility of this bias. which is, and the focus of the book is strategic advantages of psychological biases. And what I need is an illustrative case study, not a formal test. I'm not arguing that they are adaptive in most situations in modern settings. All I'm saying is that let's look at them not always as mistakes, but as adaptive functional aspects of human behaviour. So you need an example to demonstrate how that could be the case. Also, there's a potential problem with the meaning of adaptive here. So in the Darwinian sense, it would mean increasing biological fitness through reproductive success. And in the book, I'm really only saying that it promotes the actor's goals, whatever those goals may be, and it may or may not have anything to do with their reproductive success. So the focus should be on strategic advantages rather than any hard definition of adaptive behaviour. Another important consideration is who am I arguing these biases are adaptive for? I think it's quite interesting here because it seems to me, at least from a simplistic sort of sweep of the different people involved in engaging in international interactions, is that there's a big difference between the people at the top and the bottom and the people in the middle. So if we're proposing that psychological biases have some sort of function, then they've got to be able to transmit and receive information between, ideally, individuals, as they would have been designed to do in our past. And that's true for statesmen who are, among other things, interacting with other statesmen, other people. It's not true with bureaucrats who are sitting in their office pushing bits of paper around and don't have the opportunity to interact or transmit information to others in another state or in an enemy nation or something. So I don't think psychological biases can be particularly useful in that case. But then when you get to the bottom, soldiers, maybe diplomats, people again who are interacting with others, then do have the opportunity for those biases to work, for the same mechanisms to work in the same ways. The other big question, though, is are leaders representative at all? If we're focused on psychological mechanisms shared by all normal, mentally healthy adults, does it make any sense to focus on political leaders who may not be normal? There's an important distinction here to make about psychology versus pathology, especially if you start doing case studies on someone like Hitler. I think that you could argue that it doesn't matter. It might mean that biases are more important. So you don't want to study someone who has a psychiatric disorder, but if you're studying someone who has an extreme level of overconfidence, say, maybe it's just more likely to be able to demonstrate the point. These two books down at the bottom are actually about normal political candidates, and the argument is they are not normal people. They get up every day believing they're right and they're better than other people, despite a lot of criticism, and do that for their entire lives.
It's the academics.
This is a slightly strange study by, very interesting study by an emeritus psychiatrist at Kentucky called Arnold Ludwig. The book is called King of the Mountain, and it's basically a sort of primatological look at politics. But what he did is he read through the biographies of, he claims, every single 20th century political leader, and then retrospectively diagnosed them for a bunch of psychological disorders, including mania, paranoia, alcohol abuse, drug abuse, and so on. Really interesting book. Bit hard to know how solid the data are, but what this chart shows is his estimate of, among the different types of leaders he identified, from monarchs and tyrants all the way to democrats, the percentage of them that suffered from what he would call clinical mania. And the dotted line is the population average, which is 0.8% of the population. And what he argues is that in all cases, including in Democrats, the political leaders we know and love, they're actually overrepresented in terms of suffering from mania. So it makes it all very interesting, but also adds to the complexity of demonstrating that common psychological biases, which we all share, are necessarily operating in the same way among political leaders. Okay, so that's the idea of the book. Hopefully you get it. what I want to do is sort of focus on one example. I had the 5 biases I'm going to work on while I'm here. I'm just going to do one today. Talk about how it's applied in political science at the moment, the experimental evidence for the bias of overconfidence, the sources of variation. If you don't have sources of variation, it can't explain variation in war and peace. What the potential adaptive functions are, and then what the case study might be. And within this, I'll show you an experiment we did and a model about whether it might have some sort of adaptive function. So current applications. Are there any political scientists here? No. Yes, good, okay. Well, they can probably tell you I've sort of been caricaturing the discipline quite strongly, and I'm going to do it again. For many political scientists who are sort of steeped in the rational choice paradigm, they see wars as a puzzle. Because if states are rational, then they should be able to avoid the costs of conflict in a pre-war bargain that reflects their relative power. Okay, so war shouldn't happen. There are many caveats to this. Strong states may anticipate the spoils of victory. Weak states may anticipate an improvement in their bargaining position. So you can think of exceptions, but on the whole, war is often seen as a problem because both sides, even the winners, would be better off avoiding it. So one solution to this so-called war puzzle, which has actually been noted for a long time by historians and political scientists, is the idea that states may be overconfident about their chances of success, which reduces the perceived costs of conflict and increases the perceived benefits. So maybe overconfidence is part of the explanation. And you can just find lots of examples of this. General Custer is supposed to have said that he could whip all of the Indians on the continent with the 7th Cavalry. General John Sedgwick's last words at one of the battles in the Civil War was that they couldn't hit an elephant at this distance. The history of war is sort of littered with examples like this, which are anecdotal, but when there have been sort of systematic studies of the causes of war, this overconfidence argument seems to stand very strongly. This is a famous study of the causes of war by Geoffrey Blainey, a historian, who argued that throughout his book, despite looking at lots of different political explanations for war, an underlying theme was what he called false optimism. And optimism is a vital prelude to war, he said. Anything which increases that optimism is a cause of war, anything that dampens it is a cause of peace. 25 years later, another book also called The Causes of War by political scientist Stephen Van Evera at MIT came to pretty much the same conclusion. His arguments were that there are lots of other political explanations for war, but one of the themes throughout was overconfidence, and he argues that at least some false optimism, as they like to call it, about relative power preceding every major war since 1740, as well as many other wars. Now, I've heard other political scientists say this is a massive exaggeration, but the point is that many political scientists believe that overconfidence is important as a cause of war, but they don't have an explanation of why people are overconfident or when they're overconfident. So, some experimental evidence about this bias. I call it overconfidence, but it really draws on a literature on so-called positive illusions, which has been led actually by Shelley Taylor here in UCLA psychology. And the idea is that people tend to have positive illusions about 3 different things. They tend to overestimate themselves, they overestimate their control over events, and they overestimate the future and their role in it. And there's a whole bunch of different types of studies in different domains, but the general sort of message is that somewhere between 70% and everyone rate their own qualities as better than others, the above average effects. But it's not only the above average effect. They sometimes do these nice experiments compared against exam results, some sort of concrete outcome, and find the same thing. And the idea, though, is that, you know, we can't all be as excellent as we think we are, so it sort of implies some sort of positive illusions. Literally hundreds of studies on this. Some of them are very large samples. One of them is over 1 million high school students, for example. Lots of subjects, and all student subjects. Some of them are athletes, some of them are people with illnesses. So it's a pretty solid, robust concept. Here's some examples. One study found 94% of college professors claim to do above average work. I showed this slide at Stanford once and someone put their hand up and said, at Stanford that's true. 90% of people claim to be above average drivers. This is perhaps the famous one you've heard of. 94% of men claim to have above average athletic ability, and so on, but in a really broad range of domains: intelligence, skill, health, managerial skills, leadership, lifespan. And the other side of the coin, people also underestimate their chance of being involved in a car accident, in an earthquake, and so on. So given this, the war puzzle perhaps is no surprise at all. Daniel Kahneman wrote recently that the bottom line is that all the biases in judgment that have been identified in the last 15 years tend to bias decision-making toward the hawkish side. So you might expect we have this sort of big mixture of biases in our brains. Sometimes it helps us to cooperate, sometimes it helps us to get involved in conflict. And he argues that actually they're all steering us in the wrong direction, if you like. And several of these biases lead to overconfidence. The problem with all this, though, is can we just take the results from experimental psychology and dump them into political science? People do this in the lab, so they must do it in war too. We did an experiment to try and examine whether the same phenomena is evident in conflict settings as well. And this was a study I did at Harvard in collaboration with Steve Rosen. Rose McDermott is a political scientist and was at UCSB for a while, is now at Brown, and then Richard Wrangham. Great student subject population with lots of variance. On the right, Harvard students protesting against war, and on the left is Harvard students engaging in war when they invaded and occupied Larry Summers' office during a big dispute. So lots of nice variation in the subject population. And three very simple hypotheses. Are people overconfident about their expectations of success, just like all the other studies have shown, but in conflict settings? We also predict that overconfidence and resorts to war should be more pronounced among males. I haven't talked about this much now, but Richard Wrangham proposed that positive illusions may have been selected for because of their role in intergroup competition, in which case we would expect them in males without a strong prediction for females. But then most importantly, are those who are most overconfident also more likely to resort to war? So is there any sort of causal result of being overconfident? Does it actually cause more conflict? I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but it was basically a computer game which was designed from scratch. There were 200 subjects paired anonymously. They were given a hypothetical conflict over resources which they had to resolve in any way they wanted to. They interacted via computers, and they had this budget to allocate at the beginning, and then played over 6 rounds. And they made simultaneous decisions. It was very open. It was deliberately open, so they could do all sorts of things. They could collaborate, they could pass messages, cooperate, split resources instead of fighting over them. But we did get a lot of violence as well. And what this shows is our measure of overconfidence. We asked people before they started the game, how well do you think you're going to do? There were 200 people in the experiment. What rank do you think you are? So a lower number here means they're expected to do better. So the median would be 100, and females were not overconfident, but males were significantly so. And there was a strong sex difference. We asked them the same question again after the game, and it's quite interesting because the men, without actually knowing the results, evidently found it was harder than they expected, and there was no longer any sex difference. But here's the really interesting result. So were those who expected to do better, our measure of overconfidence, more likely to attack their opponent? Clark?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you right here. I was just, are you going to give us a little more detail about what the decisions they're actually making are?
I wasn't going to, but yeah.
Just a little.
Yeah, sorry, I tend to. Okay. They could invest their money into what we call industrial production, basically create stuff, or they could buy military equipment. So they could decide how to allocate the resources, and then at each time step they could decide to negotiate, surrender, attack their opponent, pass a message, various things. So it was pretty open-ended.
Okay, thanks.
So the hypothesis is, people who are more overconfident are more likely to attack their opponents, and this is indeed the case. So hawks and doves here just means those who made unprovoked attacks on their opponents versus those who didn't. And the hawks were much more likely to be those who believed they would do well in the game, and this was exclusively due to males.
So is it because, I'm trying to figure out the second graph, so is this because males are, so this is among males who were hawks?
Yeah. So
Okay.
basically saying, here are the hawks, here are the dark bar is those who decided to attack their opponent. And they had, on average, significantly higher expectations of how well they would perform. It's not a perfect measure of overconfidence, of course, but that's the idea. Yeah.
Sorry, just one more question. So is their probability of winning a function of their investment decisions? So
Yes, yeah.
Invested more in military.
Exactly. Yeah.
So do you control for that in this?
Do you control for it?
Correlation between being hawkish and the investment decisions?
That's interesting. No. What we did look at is whether hawks were more likely to win, and that wasn't the case.
Okay.
The people who did best were women, and people who did not engage in conflict, which was costly. But we didn't do exactly what you said, which is, controlling for costs. Was hawkishness advantageous? We should look at that.
You might expect that there'd be an interaction because the most overconfident individuals would invest proportionately less in
Right.
military expenditures and attack anyway, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. I did look at investments, and I can't remember the results, but I'm going to look at that. Thanks. We tested a whole bunch of other things, so lots of personality inventories, and one of the ones which sort of stuck out was the narcissistic personality inventory, which is sort of a measure of how great do you think you are. And this also correlated with levels of aggression. So again, among males in particular, it was men who had a high perception of how great they were that were more likely to attack their opponent. So if you like, another perhaps more general measure of confidence. So the point of that was to say it's just one tiny little step, but it does seem to be that the kind of positive illusions idea is also evident in conflicts at least relevant to war. Lots of limitations of the experiment, of course. Source of variation. This is really important. Are there systematic sources of variation in overconfidence? And I'm describing the example of overconfidence. I'm going to be going through exactly the same thing with the other 4 biases. If everyone is overconfident all the time, how can you explain variation in war and peace? This is something which political scientists ask me all the time, and they think it's a fundamental flaw for any biological explanation. And in fact, one of the fathers of modern international relations theory, Kenneth Waltz, wrote in his 1959 book that human nature itself is a sort of flawed explanation for political behaviour because it's fixed, it doesn't vary. So if it doesn't vary, it can't explain variable outcomes in politics. How's my caricature of political science going?
I'm in your camp.
Great. Sources of variation. You only have to go into a bar to see different levels of confidence. This is from the New Yorker quite recently. It's really interesting though, because there is good evidence actually that positive illusions is something we all share as normal, mentally healthy individuals. And people who are suffering from clinical depression actually have no positive illusions. So this is just a scheme. There's no data here, but just to represent what the variation is like. Let's say there's some distribution of positive illusions in the population, and 0 is here where you perceive the world and yourself accurately, and this actually applies to people suffering from depression. The average is shifted up in that direction, as the experimental psychologists tell us, men a little more, women a little less. And then perhaps, hypothetically on the right hand side, we might suspect that leaders are a little bit more confident than average. They're the ones who get out of bed every morning thinking they're great and don't care about all the criticism they're getting. And then at the extreme end, the tail end, you might have psychiatric versions of these biases. This variation is very important because then you can make predictions about when you expect to see positive illusions and when you don't. I'm not going to spend any time on this, but just to say the last time I worked on overconfidence was a set of case studies in this book which made predictions about when we should expect to see positive illusions given variation depending on institutional arrangements and regime type, which should differentially affect whether positive illusions influence policy, whether they're there or not. And then looked at 2 wars, Vietnam and World War I, and 2 crises which didn't end in war, the Munich crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and tried to test whether the sources of variation in positive illusions, as described by the psychologists, were evident there or not. And the argument was it seemed to explain when war occurs quite well. Of course, there's many other things going on, but that study focused on maladaptive outcomes. And I think the bigger and more interesting question is when and whether overconfidence can be useful. And this brings me on to the next point, which is about potential adaptive functions of overconfidence. And this actually has a good sort of background in military history. This is from von Clausewitz's famous book on war. He argued that boldness in war, he called it boldness, must be granted special certain power over and above successful calculations. Wherever it is superior, will take advantage of its opponent's weaknesses. So he wasn't very specific about it, but he certainly seemed to buy into the idea that having very high levels of confidence can actually be advantageous. Napoleon sort of said something similar. That he said the moral conviction, the moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1. Perhaps he had a vested interest in believing this, given that he was not very physically large himself. Patton sort of agreed with it and said actually it's 5 times more important. In terms of convincing political scientists, people like Napoleon and Clausewitz are quite important because they're sort of seen as the W.G. Hamiltons and Darwins of our field, I think. So if they observed something in their great experience and wisdom, then it can actually carry some weight. But there's actually broader, more generalizable reasons to believe that overconfidence can be adaptive. The psychologists themselves argue that it's adaptive, but they call it psychologically adaptive. It helps us cope with the world, if you like. It's very important to mental health. This is Shelley Taylor's main argument. It's a coping strategy. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe you're going to do well, then maybe you will do well. You'll increase your probability of doing well. It helps ambition, persistence, success, and actually seems to improve health. There's a lot of studies on people with terminal illnesses, and those with positive illusions seems to lower their stress, which aids their immune response. But perhaps more interestingly for us, there's been quite a few people now who've suggested that overconfidence may be evolutionarily adaptive. Robert Trivers argues that positive illusions may be advantageous. It's a form of adaptive self-deception, and it's very important to self-deceive because then you don't suffer any behavioural leakage that give the game away. If you act overconfident but don't believe it, you're much less likely to convince someone else. Richard Wrangham wrote this interesting article in EHB arguing basically that positive illusions may have been selected for precisely because of its role in improving combat performance. And the idea is basically that it promotes resolve and bluffing. And a couple of analogies: boxing, you act as if you expect to win, which can improve your resolve and increase your actual probability of winning. And bluffing, perhaps like poker, you act as if you have a better hand, and by acting as if you have a better hand, you're more likely to win. And then last but not least, error management theory. Marty Hazelton and Daniel Nestle's paper I think gives a very nice argument for why overconfidence may be adaptive, because if underconfidence or even accuracy is generating worse errors, then overconfidence may be adaptive. But this is all very well. How do we know overconfidence, though, performs better against alternative strategies? And to my knowledge, we just don't have any evidence on this. And it's particularly difficult in the realm of political science because we can't rerun the tape of history. So we can take a case and say, I think overconfidence helped here. But how do we know it would have helped on 1,000 of the same occasions? Well, one way to deal with this is to use simulations, and this is a project with Lars-Erik Sederman and Niels Weidmann in ETH Zurich. They use these sort of spatial settings, agent-based models, to study the behaviour of states. So what we did is created a little world with states of different levels of overconfidence or underconfidence or accuracy. This is how it was set up initially. We varied the parameters later. 100 states on a 30 by 30 grid. Each has a capital, and then the colours respond to its degree of overconfidence or underconfidence. They're all assigned this confidence factor at the beginning. And it's a log normal distribution, so that overall the median is 1, which means on average they're not biased. But among members of the population, there's some which are overconfident and some which are underconfident to different degrees. Very simple procedure. They extract resources from each of the blocks of their territory. They make a decision at each time step. They look around among their neighbours. They pick the target they perceive they're most likely to beat, with the decision rule that they'll only attack if they perceive the winning probability is greater than half. They allocate resources to that front. If they're attacked by someone else at the same time, they'll allocate resources to both fronts in proportion to the size of the attacker. Then there's an interaction with a conflict function, which is a asymptotic function based on the amount of resources you have. And then after the battle is over, you take one block of territory from a defeated state. The predictions are very simple. Overconfident states should die out because the one thing they do different to everyone else is they tend to attack stronger states sometimes. Underconfident states should also die out because often they don't attack weaker states, meaning they don't attack states that they're likely to beat. And unbiased states should dominate. They only attack if they calculate that they're likely to win. Now, I have a little movie of the So this is just an example of one run to show you what it looks like. So starts off with 30 states that are black dots, they're capitals, and then they just engage in the conflicts which I just described. And one thing I didn't explain is that often you'll see suddenly an explosion of little states. If the state capital is conquered, then the entire state will become little blocks of independent states, which inherit the same strategy as their former state. So this is over, I think, 2,000 generations. You can see the blood of war draining down across the screen. I may have just lost my place, so 1 second, sorry. So we can track what happens over time and look at it says average here, but in the end we used a median level of confidence over generations of the conflict. A single run would look like this, telling you the median confidence factor of all states still in the population from time 0 to, on here, 1,000 and something. But then when you do 200 replications of the same thing, you find this very interesting result, which is that over time there's a systematic increase in the level of confidence of the surviving states, and one is unbiased. So what happens is over time overconfident states tend to do best. If you add cost of war, yeah, Dan.
Wouldn't it have to sort of, wouldn't it sensibly have to be some sort of a Bayesian rule whereby if you win, your confidence should increase, and therefore, you know, this is...
There's no learning, there's no alliances. So we don't know what would happen. No, Lars Erik argues that if you add learning, it won't affect the result, it will just speed up the result because states will copy, if you allow learning from other states as well, states will just copy what other states are doing.
Just thinking about past experience.
Yeah, it's likely, I think it's definitely worth looking at, and we haven't done it in this model, but we'd like to do it in the future. But Lars Erik argues it won't affect the result. because they will just copy the best strategy, and the best strategy is overconfidence.
Well, that's social learning as opposed to individual learning.
Yeah.
Two things.
Right. And you were proposing individual learning rather
I just
than...
think that you would have to.
Yeah. Do you predict it would change the result?
Might make it go faster.
Yeah, I think that's what we think. It would go faster, but it wouldn't change the outcome. But we should check.
Maybe not, because you'd have a population that's sort of lost, or I don't know. There might be seed effect.
The reasons why they win, which we'll come to in a second, I think are unchanged by the mechanism of selection, by which I would include learning. So if you make war very expensive, then obviously those who fight more wars, the more overconfident ones, are going to do worse. So as you would expect, if war is very expensive, then overconfidence becomes a less good strategy.
Question.
Yeah.
Go back. How does the benefit scale with this war cost? So when is it sort of the expected return of war positive and when is it negative? You know,
When is the
showing an increased cost, but
yeah, so you mean what is this cost relative to, like how many units of your state does this, let me check and I'll tell you afterwards. It's a good question, like is this a tiny cost or is it a significant cost?
If I could follow up on that.
Yeah.
Could you go back to in the setup, so overconfidence is you go to war when the probability is greater than half, not when you go to war when the expected benefit is negative. So this is not a rational choice calculation. This is just an ad hoc calculation. So what is the expected benefit as a function of the probability of larger war?
Well, the benefit is that if you win, then you gain a chunk of territory from the opponent. But are you asking, what
happens if you lose?
And if you lose, then you lose a chunk of your own territory.
Same size chunk.
Same size chunk, yeah. And each time step you accumulate resources proportional to the number of territories that you own, number of blocks that you own.
Okay. So that's complicated because you have to think ahead that there's some flow of resources.
Yeah. We changed the amount of resources that are transferred, and it doesn't affect the results. Let me show you this, which is, so after doing that main model, we did a bunch of robustness checks where we changed a bunch of parameters. Not that here, actually, but change the size of the grid, change the shape of the, could there be some sort of boundary effect? So we also looked at a donut-shaped space. Polarity means the number of initial states in the system. Decisive conflict is to do with the conflict success function, which looks like this. And the steeper the slope is, the more decisive the conflict if you're stronger. If it's very flat, then I may still win even if I'm weaker. And this standard deviation alpha is the confidence factor. So, how much variation in overconfidence is there in the system? So across all of these different settings, it's a consistent result that the median confidence factor is greater than 1 in all cases, and the mean is actually 1.6. Too much overconfidence is bad, but some marginal level of overconfidence is good, which again is interesting given the experimental psychology literature. There's a paper by Roy Baumeister called The Optimal Margin of Illusion, and he argues that a little bit of overconfidence is good, but too much is bad. The problem with simulations, of course, is there's lots of parameters and questions about what's going on. But the idea was really just to start testing this idea. Could overconfidence be adaptive? Certainly here, the rational choice prediction fails, and overconfidence is the winning strategy, and suggests at least that it might not be a mistake, but some sort of adaptive heuristic, at least in that setting. We don't expect it to be advantageous everywhere, but there may be some sort of ecological rationality that in a given setting, a little bit of overconfidence can be good. I want to stop soon to get your comments. This is the explanation of why overconfident states win. Maybe I'll come back to that if people have a question. I don't want to spend too much time on this, other than that since doing the ABM, James Fowler and I have developed this mathematical model. He said, great ABM, but why not do a proper mathematical model and investigate the same thing, look for whether overconfidence can be an ESS. when in competition with a mixture of accurate and underconfident individuals. And what's interesting is it comes up with quite strikingly similar results. Uncertainty is really important. If you don't have any uncertainty about others' capabilities, then of course you don't have any advantage in overconfidence. But where you do have some uncertainty, and especially where you have a lot of uncertainty, overconfidence actually becomes the optimal strategy, as long as the benefit to cost ratio, so the benefit of the prize as opposed to the cost of competing for it, is greater than 2. And to me this is really interesting, because we didn't start off with any error management style thinking at all. It was just an ESS model. And in the Hazelton and Nettle paper, they argue that overconfidence is adaptive as long as benefits exceed costs, which is perfectly fine for that setting. But what happens when you mix up the population, you have some underconfident states, some overconfident states, and some accurate states, or individuals I should say, and you get a similar sort of result, but the critical threshold is slightly different. In the mathematical model it turns out to be 1.5, and in a numerical simulation where I have more continuous distribution of levels of confidence, it's similar but then becomes 2. So I think there's something fundamentally similar across these different explanations, the ABM, error management theory, and then this mathematical model. So I'm pretty convinced something is going on. So I'm going to tell the political scientists that here's a model, here's some experimental data, but I think the thing they'll care about most is a good meaty case study, which is going to be the important part of the book for overconfidence and the other 4 biases, demonstrating that in some settings overconfidence can be an advantage. I have not decided what those cases will be. These are just some ideas. I'm really keen to get your ideas over the next few weeks and months about what they might be. But I won't spend any more time on that. This is just my summary slide. I think there's huge scope for evolutionary psychology and political science. It offers a lot. Lots of subjects for analysis and applications as well. A whole bunch of different methods which will be very novel to the field. It does face significant resistance to evolutionary explanations. This is something I've experienced, and it's sort of interesting, but it means if we want to be taken seriously we have to make good arguments for why. And the idea of the book is to offer this hook of human psychological biases as adaptive, not mistakes, to get them a way of thinking about human psychology as making mistakes and start thinking about us as adaptive organisms. If you just argue that biases lead to disaster, you don't need evolutionary psychology. It's just experimental psychology. But if you argue that they do sometimes lead to success, and I think you sort of demand an evolutionary explanation of why these biases originated in the first place. Who cares? I think they will care, because ultimately it promises to improve our predictions, to improve historical explanations of events, and to demonstrate sources of variation which have real causal influence. And then this other sort of meaning of adaptive politics, which is that I think often we need to sort of start thinking about fitting political settings to human beings instead of trying to fit human beings into often arbitrarily created political arrangements. So that's the end of my talk, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback. Thanks.